I am honored today to be in conversation with Adam Keawe Manalo-Camp. Adam is a Native Hawaiian writer, poet, and Indigenous researcher raised in Papakolea homestead community. His work centers Native Hawaiian histories, Indigenous epistemologies, and cultural preservation, grounding research in lived community memory while reframing colonial narratives through a Kanaka Maoli lens. Across writing, public scholarship, and digital community spaces, Adam treats history as present tense responsibility. He has described his work as being guided by kupuna, offering research and storytelling as love letters to ancestors, place, and future generations, while connecting historical truth to contemporary identity and civic life. Welcome, Adam.
Mahalo for having me here today.
Yes. Before we begin, I just wanted to invite you to call someone into the room that's important to you, a kupuna, an ancestor, a teacher, a guiding presence, someone whose influence has, shaped how you move through the world.
Sure. I would like to call my grandmother, Sarah Kikai, to come into the space. And the reason why I would like to call her is because she grew up in a time where being Hawaiian was not a good thing, when the term Kanaka itself was used as a slur. And she was a Manaleo who was beaten for speaking the language. And one of the memories I have about her is she used to have a scar on her left hand, and that was a scar from a ruler that was inflicted upon her when she was 8 years old in school because she was talking to a classmate in Hawaiian, and the teacher got the ruler, slammed it so hard that when she passed away at the age of 93, she still had that mark. And I think about that mark often when I'm doing these communications, when I'm talking about our history, because I don't want any future line of any Hawaiian family, of any Indigenous family, to have to see that mark.
Thank you for calling her into the space. Mahalo. Well, I'm thinking, if your grandmother is so important to you and family, that obviously Papakolea as a place is also important to you. Your Iave and your Piko are literally buried there, just from what I've learned. And so it's not surprising to me that your writing consistently returns to place as a source of knowledge and accountability and memory. And so how did growing up in Papakolea and probably, with your grandmother, were probably other community, leaders, members, shape the kinds of questions that you ask today? And I think the truths that you really refuse to soften in so much of your research.
Mahalo for that question. And yes, you're actually correct. When I was born, my Piko was buried at my grandmother's homestead in Papakolea. So for myself, I consider myself to be still very spiritually attached to my grandmother's lot on Anianiku Street. Shout out to people on Anianiku Street. And whenever I do talk deeply about my personal history, I always harken back to Papakolea. And why Papakolea in particular matters to me is because so much of my grandmother's life, my mother's life, and my early life growing there was shaped by Papakolea. When my grandmother first moved up to Papakolea in 1946, Papakolea was Keawe bushes, and those people, like my grandmother and her neighbors, these women, these strong Kanaka women, used to every day cut back the Keawe bushes and turn those bushes into kalo farms. A lot of people don't realize that. So the men would go off to work at their jobs, oftentimes at the harbor, while the women were taking care of the kids and slowly reshaping the land in order to grow their own food. And with my mother's situation, what had happened was back in the late 1950s, the Board of Water Supply decided to dam the Kanaha River, which is the major river in Papakolea that used to sustain the community farms. And that reshaped everything in Papakolea. And it reshaped my mom as well, because now the people of Papakolea were forced to go to the grocery stores. They were forced to be detached from the land. And during my mother's time, there was rapid urbanization of Makiki, Tantlis, Punchbowl, and Paoa that again, it reshaped what it meant to be Hawaiian. But at the same time, we have in Papakolea phenomenal manaleo. We have phenomenal leaders that had really pushed the narrative of what it meant to be Hawaiian and who were very active in the so-called Hawaiian Renaissance. And that that history of my grandmother's generation of reshaping the land, reclaiming the land away from these invasive species, because Keawe bushes are invasive species, and trying to sustain their lives off the land. And then my mother's generation being still technically on the land, but no longer being able to
Mm-mm.
be sustained on the land. And my mother's generation was also the generation that underwent the process of statehood. And I have stories about that as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, as we come to statehood, that makes me, I want to kind of stay on place. One is Iolani Palace, just down the street, where you just came from. But thinking of places that you were raised or places that you live, things that impact you, it's also a place of like outside of Hawaii. The last time that I saw you in person, it was at the Hawaiian Council meeting in just outside of Seattle. And so, what role has the dialogue in diaspora? Just as you were talking about your grandmother's experience, your mother's experience of like the landscape changing so much. I mean, talk about landscape changing. When you move to a completely different geography, you're on a different aina. And how has that also shaped um, your research and your writing and your perspectives?
So I first left Hawaii when I was 20, 21, 22, and I traveled in different places. I traveled to the Philippines. I traveled to Thailand. I've traveled actually through most of Southeast Asia. I've also traveled to Europe. Um, but I kept on coming back home to Hawaii, of course. And what had happened was that I ended up moving to Las Vegas about 6 years ago. And some of that had to do with financial issues, like a lot of people in the diaspora. But what had actually made me stay in Las Vegas a little bit longer, what than I had wanted to be honest, was because of medical care. I was like diagnosed with leukemia, and my doctors had told me that because of the form of leukemia that I have, um, I'm going to have to, the, the medical care in Hawaii is not as capable of handling it as on the continent. That if I were to move back home to Hawaii, they would still have to refer me outside to the continent. So that was one factor in why I'm still living over there,
Mm.
even though my Pico is still very much attached to Hawaii. And that is a perspective that I think is lacking in how we view the diaspora. That we often view our communities in Las Vegas, California, Seattle, and whatnot, um, that these people chose to leave Hawaii, that they chose to abandon Hawaii. And I think that it's much more complex. And I think that we're too often blaming the victims of the oppressive economic system that has pushed these communities into the diaspora, and that we are forgetting about, you know, situations like mine, medical reasons, but also situations where, like, we have a lot of Hawaiians who, for better or for worse, are in the armed forces and they have no choice of where they live. But and there's also Kanaka who have moved off of Hawaii because their families here are not in good situations and they need that space in order to heal for themselves. And I get that. And when I'm writing about these types of histories and these types of situations, I'm very keenly aware of how the narratives of our diaspora are being shaped by people like me and by people in Hawaii and by cultural experts. And I want our communities, wherever they are, to be seen, to be heard, and to be felt. That, you know, this we're not just statistics. We are real people. And so I think about those matters a lot. And as you had mentioned, you know, I view my writings not as like blogs or anything like that. I view them as love letters to my ancestors, but I also view them as um, letters to people like me who were growing up in the diaspora, who, in one way, long to be in Hawaii but can't be in Hawaii because of situations beyond their control. So at least keeping that memory alive um, is something that is a kuleana that I feel um, I have to practice.
And so, specifically to being at the palace today, obviously, in recognition of the overthrow of the 132nd right anniversary of the illegal overthrow. What kind of kuleana do you feel, right, especially when you write about or you participate in, or you are an active voice in these spaces that are addressing specific like touchstones in history that have created such significant shifts for our community?
But Iolani Palace itself, for me, besides Papaklea, is a place that I always go back to as well. My first paid job was as a greeter at Iolani Palace, and I became a docent later on. So my journey into public history actually began with Iolani Palace and the Friends of Iolani Palace, and with curators such as Jim Bartels and Corinne Chun.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to recognize that. But like today was the 133rd anniversary of the illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And when I had been giving interviews and doing some of the press stuff for this event, I made, and I also read a poem today as well. And I made it very clear that, I am someone from the diaspora and I'm home. And we are not all Kanaka can come home. And being here and being able to do the things I can and being able to highlight how history has impact, how the overthrow continues to impact our communities today, including how it impacts Kanaka in the diaspora today, is something that I brought up actually when I was speaking. And in a way, I was also trying to bring a voice to those who could not be here. And those who, when I mean could not be here, I mean those who couldn't physically be here, but also those who have passed away in these, Aina A, in these foreign lands.
And is there, for you, what's when you're in front of an audience that is Kanaka, and we are talking about these kinds of events that can really be seen as tragic or trauma inducing, still have an aha in us, and you're providing that voice, is it stories of inspiration or stories of fact? What is your goal? Like you were saying, you even write poetry. So I'm just interested in kind of how do you frame your presentation when you're coming into a space like that where there can be such a mix of intense emotions.
I think sometimes as Kanaka, because of the generational trauma that the Great Mahele as well as the overthrow cost us as a people, there's a tendency for us to kind of try to bury it
Mm-hmm.
and try to just kind of push it down, push it down, push it down, trying to be, happy Kanaka, the happy native, right? That's the stereotype that is often, portrayed. And when I'm like writing my poetry and whatnot, I induce it with longing, love for Hawaii, but also the rage that sometimes we feel when we think about the fact that when we think about things, for example, in my situation, my mother was on the Hawaiian Homeland's waiting list for 40 years, and she passed away on the waiting list. And I know of so many families on the continent who moved away from Hawaii and who had grandparents and parents who died on the waiting list. And I allow myself to kind of feel that rage for other people as well. But at the same time, how do we make that rage into something that is conducive, something that we can turn into not something positive, but something that would gear us towards social activism, towards justice.
I mean, like it's like it transmutes that anger into action, right? It's not that you're going to be happy, but it's like forward
Yes,
movement.
yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. Um, I was reading as well, like it was Olelo Hawaii your first language versus English.
That is correct.
When I was talking to one of their guests earlier, Kaimi, in terms of Olelo Hawaii and English, are there times that you ever write in Olelo Hawaii or maybe write feeling certain emotions? I could see maybe even thinking in Olelo, but also writing in English because to impact a wider audience. So, how do you hold those two languages? How they also are able to like express a Hawaiian state of mind, and then also that Olelo was something that was also like made banned in terms of instruction. It in and of itself, right, is kind of pivotal to even use. And I'm just wondering what role Olelo Hawaii plays in your expression,
Mm.
poetry and writing.
Oh, well, thank you for the question. I've actually been debating on how much Olelo Hawaii I should be using in my social media posts in particular,
Mm.
because of the fact that I want to normalize the language, and that's important. But at the same time, I've also talked with many other Kanaka and many other kupuna where they feel like there's still a lot of deep trauma with the
Mm.
language. That when they still see the language, there's like a mental block because of the fact that they were told that speaking Olelo Hawaii was hupo, was stupid,
Mm.
that you were stupid for being Hawaiian, that if you were Kanaka, you were backwards, So that has been a challenge. Like, how do I present that to a wider audience who, one hand, I'm trying to encourage Hawaiian, but on the other hand, it's not only that they may not understand it or understand the deep context to it, but do I want to re traumatize people?
Mm. Yeah.
So, like, on one hand, I try to encourage it. So, like, when I do like meetings and whatnot, I will prepare the agenda bilingually. And yeah, if I'm thinking about certain deep topics in Hawaiian, or in sorry, if I'm thinking about deep topics in Hawaiian history or in Hawaiian culture, sometimes I will write out what I'm actually thinking in Olelo Hawaii first, and then try to translate that into English somehow.
Mm, versus starting
Yes,
versus
yeah.
starting with English. So for you, just on a personal level, though, is speaking Olelo like a healing? Is that something that's a positive for you?
When I speak Olelo Hawaii, when I have the opportunity to speak Olelo Hawaii, I hear my grandmother's voice. I hear my mother's. My mother was not a Manaleo. By the time that she was raised, Hawaiian had been out of the household for decades, and only returned in the household back in the 1970s as a result of the Hawaiian Renaissance. But my mother was very much a Kanaka who had a lot of deep seated insecurities and trauma about Olelo Hawaii, about learning Olelo Hawaii. And she actually took classes from KCC to try to regain
Mm.
her knowledge of Hawaiian. And she used to actually practice with me. And like I mean, that's one of my favorite memories with my mom is correcting her homework. So, but at the same time, even with me, there is a level of trauma with Olelo Hawaii because although by the time I was born, Olelo Hawaii had become this an official language of the state of Hawaii. Punana Leo still hadn't been formed yet.
Hmm.
Well, it had actually been formed, but they were still fighting in the Supreme Court to remove the act that forbid Olelo Hawaii from being a medium of instruction. So it existed, but it wasn't really,
Hmm.
we couldn't enroll in it. And as growing up in Papakolea, there is a legacy of the English standard schools because Lincoln, Stevenson, and Roosevelt were so called normal schools, and English was the only medium of instruction. And in fact, those schools, you had to actually take examinations in order to enter those schools. My mother was a graduate of the normal school system, actually, one of the last graduates of the normal school system. And so by the time I enrolled in kindergarten at Lincoln Elementary School, um, I had already been used to Olelo Hawaii because of my grandmother. My grandmother had, my mom used to leave me with my grandmother all the time. So like that's her language. I used to go to church with her. Her church services were actually in Olelo Hawaii. Um, but when I went to kindergarten, what had happened was they didn't know how to actually address that issue. So they actually put me in English as a second language class. So it was like me, some Vietnamese and some Chinese,
Hmm.
all struggling to learn English in a school that was literally across the street from a Hawaiian homestead.
Wow. Okay, I just want to pause on that. I mean, that's a poignant fact, really. Wow.
So, and I hated English as a second language classes because the teachers were always very mean and like hyper American. I mean, like, I remember first grade where we had to repeat the Pledge of Allegiance several times until we could pronounce it in a more reasonably fluent standard American accent.
Mm.
And yeah, so, but by the time I was in fifth grade, English had become my primary language. Um, and I still feel that disconnection that I forced myself to become an English language speaker because that was the only way to survive.
Hmm.
And those classes were torture for me. And that is also something I can relate to deeply with my grandmother that, we had to assimilate. And again, we were forced to assimilate in a school right across the street from a Hawaiian homestead community and on land that used to belong to King Lunalilo.
Mm. I do want to ask about some of your current writing being in digital spaces, but based on what we're talking about right now, I think it's so important to ask, what made you choose writing? It just especially right with this kind of tension and this struggle between English and Olelo. And then also though, when you chose writing, was it within this vein of like a historical scholar, right? So that you would write along these topics, or was it, just a love of writing, and then you ended up moving to kind of into a historical political space? What was that catalyst for you?
That's a very interesting question. So I'm Hawaiian. I'm also Filipino, and there are certain stereotypes. By the way, I also speak Tagalog,
Mm.
and I also speak Spanish. Um, but anyway, so I'm Hawaiian and Filipino. There's a stereotype that Hawaiians and Filipinos are very good singers. Unfortunately, I was not given any of those gifts. So, like, I like to joke around that because I could not dance hula, and because I can't chant, I can't oli, I can't sing, I went into writing. Uh,
The silent art.
the silent art, right? But also it's to be honest with you, I began to write years and years ago because I was trying to remember some of the teachings of my mother and my grandmother. I didn't want to forget those memories, and I was still trying to like remember what I had learned before the fifth grade when I was still in a Lalo Hawaii speaker um, at that level. And so for me, it was kind of like a therapy session at first, that I was writing these cultural traits, these cultural histories, but also learning about Hawaiian culture. So the first step was the culture, then the history came. Um, I just found our people, the wisdom of our people, so deeply healing
Mm.
and so deeply profound. I just wanted to share it. And so I just began writing. That was, you can say, the catalyst. It was just my eagerness to kind of, hey, I was reading this newspaper over here, and it's talking about the police officer who was shot on January 17, 1893.
Mm.
Like, did you know about this? And a lot of our Hawaiians, because of our education system, we don't know much. A lot of Hawaiians don't really know a lot of the details of our history, um, and a lot of the details of our culture. And so, yeah, I began writing. I wanted to share. I wanted to just talk to other Hawaiians about, hey, did you know this? So yeah, it was sharing, but also trying to have a conversation with the community as well. So that
Mm.
my earliest writings actually reflected things about Hawaiian spirituality, about um, Olelo no Eau, and those things. And slowly it began to get into more um, historical and political perspectives.
Yeah. What era, like what age or what grade in school was that where you started to have an inkling that writing was going to be something that was a part of your life?
So the first time I ever got published was in volume two of OEV, a Native Hawaiian journal.
Yes.
And the reason how I got published, I was like 16 years old. And I had written this whole long essay about Kuʻokoʻa and his world tour. And it found its way to Mahialani Dudois. And then she contacted me saying, do you want to publish that in OEV? And I'm like, it's not really good. I lacked the confidence.
Hmm.
I was a teenager. And she was like, no, this is not the writing of a teenager. This is college level. But how you broke down these events,
Mm.
you know, more people need to hear it. So she asked me to expand on my original essay. She really mentored me in my writing, and I always credit Mahalani Dudwa also as an inspiration for me. And um, I do think about her a
Yeah.
lot when I'm writing, and especially my poetry, because she also had inspired me to go into poetry as well, because she said to me, one of her advices to me was that there are just certain things you cannot say in an essay or a scholarly, article.
Hmm.
There's just things that you just can only be expressed by the rhythm of a poem, because how you breathe is just like writing a poem.
Mm.
So yeah, so I began actually writing poetry when I was still a teenager, but I kept a lot of my poetry hidden into recently.
Hmm. Oh, well, I really appreciate you sharing that. That's really a beautiful, and I can see the covers of the OEV journal as well. That was a really special time, I think. Um, Currently, right, a lot of your work lives in digital spaces, public spaces, places where history is often encountered quickly or out of context, or it's shaped by this, you know, economy that fragments attention instead of deepens it. And so when your work, and I would think, right, it's more so in the current era, maybe not when you were first writing, right, enters these fast digital spaces, like kind of like what are you maybe listening for rather than designing for? Or how do you stay oriented to poe who are, searching for learning, who want some ike and connection? Or do you just write from, from your na'au, write what you want to write, um, trusting that like the words will go out and reach the people that they're supposed to reach?
So a lot of times, to be perfectly honest, I'll research something, then stumble upon something else, and then that gets me really excited. Then I end up posting about it. But there are also times where people ask me, like privately, "Hey, would you mind writing your manao about this topic?" I'm like, "Okay." But there are also times where I dream about a topic, that something that I have a dream that,
Mm.
hey, you need to say something about this and this and this. There's someone that needs to hear this. So those are the ways that I communicate. But the other thing, like, lately, that's been happening is that I've been trying to connect historical touchstones in Hawaiian history with the present day. Um, because I also am finding out that the younger generation, that's how they connect with history, if they can connect it with their lives today.
Mm. Um, Also, I think, in these digital spaces, and I'm connecting this to January 17th, and in that political sense, right? Political conflict. I feel like we're in a contemporary political conflict, and specific to writing online, especially about history, especially I think where it's so vital, right, to get facts correct, um, but also to hold that line about tone. um, what do you feel your kuleana is in the current landscape where it's just so tumultuous, I think, politically, and then I think etiquette, even online, the way people can just kind of call out others when they're not right, or at least they're saying they're not. I just, as I've listened to you today, there's so much of your work, I think, that like connects to kupuna or lives in like spiritual spaces. How do you, I guess, instead stay centered, or walk that line, right, of your own path with all of the distractions or kind of chaos around you?
So academic wise, I'm actually finishing up a master's in history with a focus on public history. And my particular interest is in decolonizing museum spaces.
Oh, interesting.
And I'm saying that because that's also something I've been trying to figure out in terms of social media. How do we
Mm,
decolonize the digital spaces? And how do we, what is the methodology that we are using when we're reclaiming our history? So those are issues, and yeah, those are issues that I actually think about. But in addition to that, yeah, there's so much. I mean, I hate to say this, but there's so much AI slop on
mm,
the internet that it is a struggle for many people to figure out what is real, what is not real, what is factually accurate, and whatnot. So, like for me personally, if you look at my posts, there's usually a last slide that actually names my sources
mm-hmm,
when it comes to books and stuff. Um, so that way, it's not a matter of credibility. It's a matter of I want people to read books,
mm-hmm.
to read, learn how to research on their own. It's fine you disagree with me, but at least have your sources and at least have these sources verified. You know, um, but right, there are topics where you cannot necessarily verify it through Western methodologies, right? You, it's someone's lived experiences. It's a spiritual
Mm-hmm.
space, and those are valid as well when we're talking about certain topics. But we also need to be clear on where we are getting these ideas, where we are getting these types of mana'o from,
Mm-hmm.
so that way people will know. And lately, because of the current political climate in the United States that's impacting Hawaii, finding reliable sources is incredibly hard. And we have I'm sorry to get a little bit political,
Please, safe space.
but we have a regime that gaslights its own people. And one of the things that I've learned from Maria Reza, in her book, Standing Up to a Dictator, is that we need to create networks of solidarity and we need to create trust among people. And one of the ways is we need to we need to fact check. We need to understand different people's perspectives, but we also have to stand up to when regimes like the current one is trying to deny what we are seeing and feeling in front of us.
And so, thinking about those who are that emergent generation now in Hawaii, but also globally, what do you think is some of the most important skills that are necessary? I'm just thinking, right, you locked into writing, but you also mentioned research. Um, but in just reflecting on the short time that we've talked, community, right, and close connections with family members have been important. But as you've traveled, as you've talked to many people, especially in the line of work that you do, what do you feel is some of the most important skills that are just really vital for this up and coming generation to have, considering, the political landscape, especially.
That's a tough question because I mean it's easy to say that we have to teach our youth critical thinking skills, but the truth of the matter is, what are critical thinking skills in the first place? We have to go back to the basics. We have to learn what makes a source a source.
Mm,
What makes how can we verify something that we can agree on? for the next generation, I mean, this is slightly off topic, but in the original flyer for that I was sent about this particular program, um, there was a talk, there was a mention of Kuʻokoʻa as being interdependent, right?
Right, that it is independence, but how can we begin to frame it as interdependence? Hmm.
But maybe that is something that we need to be teaching our kids as well in terms of when we're doing fact checking and whatnot, is that not just interdependence, but intra
Mm.
dependence, that we are all part of a whole that works together collectively. That because interdependence implies that there's differences, but
Mm.
intradependence implies that what I am is the same as you. We're connected, right? We're connected because of this aina. We're connected. Maybe we're related. We don't know. Um, but we're also connected through the environment. Like with the Kumalipo, for example, it's a genealogy chant, right? That shows how this particular line of chiefs is connected to everyone,
Mm.
not just Kanaka Maoli, but everyone in the Pacific. If you go by Dr. Wilbalai Johnson's analysis of
Hmm.
the Kumalipo, and you go before that, the gods, Naakua, and then before that, um, the realm of Po, which includes nature. So when we're talking about the kids, what something that the kids have to learn, yeah, critical thinking skills, but also to recognize that intradependence, that we are part of a larger ecosystem, and that when we're talking about history, when we're talking about culture, we have to recognize what we say. How would that impact you? How would that impact you? Um, and that is something I think needs to have more discussions about. Is that that is a way of also fact checking? Is
Mm.
how something that you say is going to impact others around you.
Mm. That's beautiful. I also feel, you know, the perfect way to kind of tie up this conversation as you take us to Po and the Kumulipo and the spiritual realm as a place to, in a sense, right, kind of fact check us that's based on community, kind of even calling, right, in your family and your grandmother back into the room. My last question is really rooted in a question that came out of my talk this morning with Kaimi, where he was speaking about hula and chants with prophecy. And what he really wanted to see was like new chants about the new prophecy, the new visions. And so, my question to you is, with these people that were so important to you in your life that set this foundation, and with the importance of your work, and I feel really being the driver for you is like your connection to this spiritual space and to others. What is your, if you were to write a prophecy or that vision, what is your desired vision of a Hawaii in the future? What is that for Adam?
And we turn to the stewardship of the land, and and looking at, do we really need these types of developments? Do we really did we really need all of these highways? Do we really need all of these huge buildings and concrete and whatnot, instead of food systems, instead of healthcare, instead of being able to be in community with each other? And I think that that is a paradox with social media, is that you can build hundreds of thousands of followers, millions of followers. I think I have 32,000 followers. Um, but you can still feel isolated. And if my vision of a Hawaii would be something that would be a community where people know who lives next to them, where people feel like they can just be themselves, that they're safe, and that a community, yeah, that people in the community feel safe, and that, you know, do you mind if I quickly just talk about? Sorry, I know this is supposed to be a closing question,
No,
but
but let's go with what you're feeling called to talk about.
I mean, I want us to be a lahui in the real sense of a lahui. And people, when we talk about the term lahui, we think of nation and race, right? Because of the fact that we Hawaiians, we've adopted the Westphalian idea of a nation state because of the Hawaiian kingdom, right? We had centuries of indigenous governance, and we eventually adopted this Western idea of a nation state because it was meant to protect us from being invaded. Um, but when you look at the word lahui as a cognate in the rest of Polynesia, um, for example, rahui in Tahitian, rahui in among the Maori means a place that has been sanctified, that is under kapu.
Mm-hmm.
So the original Maimana'o is that the original meaning of lahui comes deep from ancient Polynesian thought that a lahui is a community or people that have been made sacred, that have been consecrated and called upon to become a community. And I think going back to the prophecy idea is we have to go back to this idea of a lahui as being a sacred space shared by all of us who believe who believe in it and who want to engage in it and who have a kuleana and feel like they have a kuleana in it. And so if I were to prophesize, I would want a new lahui that's based upon this idea of a community that is together out of a shared sacredness, out of a shared willingness to be together and to be in a safe space, that no one is left behind. I mean, in Olelo, Hawaii, prior to the missionaries, we didn't even have a word for orphan
Mm-hmm.
because we all took care of each other. And that's the kind of lahui that I would want to live in.
That's the kind of lahui I would want to live into. Thank you.
Mahalo.
Mahalo.